Hi everybody, hola, and welcome to another edition of the Web of Wyrd podcast. Now today I'm going to be chatting with my new co-host. I'm still doing the shows with Pete, we do those every fortnight, but in between I'm going to be doing additional shows with some of my very profound and lovely friends who've got a lot to share. And today I'm going to be introducing you to my friend Emily Watt, who is an acupuncturist, a Moxabustionist, a mother of four, a farmer, and has just recently been on the Dandelion immersion with us, sharing some of her Eastern medicine wisdom. So, hi, Emily, how are you today?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. I'm good. I'm hiding from the sun in the UK, which is just about to finish its amazing spell over here. But yeah, other than that, I'm excellent, thanks.
Good. Well, we are going to talk a little bit about some of the things that came out of the recent Dandelion immersion, but I would just like to start actually on this point about the heat wave that Britain's experiencing. So in the last podcast with Pete, we were making a little bit of fun about how come Britain gets to have a drought after a few weeks of no rain, which in itself is a very strange thing in Britain, really. But somebody very nicely messaged me after that podcast and said, yeah, I totally get what you're saying, but just to let you know, down in Devon, we haven't had any rain for 3 months. And the individual then went on to say, well, you know what was really interesting though was when I would go down to the coast, because I lived on the south coast of Devon, and they would see the weather patterns coming in, and then they would see what they assumed were chemtrails in the sky, and they saw the weather being diverted away from the land back out towards sea. So I do wonder, many people have messaged about the chemtrails in the past and what effect are they having and etc. So I'm just wondering from your perspective, because I know this is something we've talked about a lot, Ems, over the years, especially when I was living in Wales. What do you think about this? Because we used to see a lot of chemtrails in South Wales, right?
So we're farmers, and I've worked with the land and with animals pretty much all my life, actually, not as long as my other half, who's the 8th generation farmer. So his family have got a long history of knowledge of what the weather does over the years. And I'm not sure. The jury's out for me on whether what we're experiencing is just Mother Nature going through her normal processes with a hell of a lot more media attention and hype, feasting on it to whip people into a frenzy that they seem to be hungry for, or whether this is something we've created through loss of biodiversity and imbalancing nature through our consumerist behavior, or whether it's something that's consciously being manipulated. I don't know. Maybe it's all three of those. I feel that there's a little bit of everything going on, but I think overall the patterns of Mother Nature are the strongest. And if you talk to some of the people that have worked with water and with the farmland and with nature for generations, they will say, look, this spring dries up. And believe me, I am in this right now. Every single person, even in Wales, where it's wet, every person on a spring is hauling water. I've been down to our pump 6 times a day trying to get the water up so we can just flush the loo. Everybody else on a spring round here is either dry or very nearly dry. It's really dry, but I don't think it's apocalyptically dry. And if you talk to the chap who fixes people's water sources on the farms, he will say, he was talking to my husband the other day and said, look, this is nothing compared to 1976, for example, where he said if you threw a pitchfork down into a crack in the ground, you'd lose the pitchfork. He said it was that dry. Everything died. The hedges died. The trees died. It just hadn't rained. But here's the other end, the end of that story. He said, even though it was that dry in 76, it started raining on the August bank holiday, and it didn't stop. He said at the end, by the end of the year, the average rainfall for 1976 was above normal. So Mother Earth balanced it all out. It was a bit, who knows what was going on there? Maybe there were chemtrails going on then, but that was certainly a freak year. And really interestingly, I'm going to loop that straight back to something that I got from the your dandelion immersion, was listening to, I think it was Kelly Hunter, talking about what the 8-8 portal is, the alignment of Sirius and the sun. The Lion's Gate portal was important for the Egyptians, because they knew at that point, when you had that planetary alignment, the water would come, the Nile would flood, and the crops would be fertilized and watered, and you would have abundance. And actually, if you look at over the years, we have the Green Man Festival every year here, and pretty much without fail, it's knee deep in water. It's always wet for the Green Man, apart from the odd freak year.
I know about the Green Man Festival because I used to live in the same area, and anyone who's ever been to Green Man always says the same thing. It's
on the August bank holiday.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting, you know, and thanks for bringing those points into the PSEMs, because you know, it wasn't actually where we were going to start today's conversation, but you know, I think it's super interesting for all of those reasons. And of course, 76 is a year that we both know very well, because it's when we entered into this realm. But that's interesting, you know, how you can perceive that Mother Earth balances things back out, because I have a similar but different situation going on here in the orchard where I live. And this is also something that I wondered about when I was living in Wales, was the seeming increase of pests on the plants: green fly, black fly, grey fly. We've got an infestation of locusts and grasshoppers that we're trying to work out what to do with. And I seem to recall 2 years ago, when this whole process started in 2020, and there were a lot of, let's say, patterns in the sky, that I noticed that all of my plants seem to be inundated with far more pests than ever before. And I've heard the same thing from people back home again this year. So the point I want to make here is that I'm wondering now, and watching what's going on in this very, very balanced ecosystem in the orchard that I live in, to see whether the plants that are getting inundated, if some of them are sacrifice plants, so that other plants don't then go down. I also every year watch the wormwood, which we're going to talk about later, always gets the black fly. And I've always wondered, it's so strange that a plant that's so anti-parasitic has to go through a parasitic process every year. And I've started to wonder whether it's actually a symbiotic relationship between particularly wormwood and the parasites. Somehow it maybe makes the medicine stronger, or it has to take on board some kind of parasitic energy so that it makes it better able to deal with that for humans. So a few points in there that we can play around with, but I love the idea of the balance coming back through Mother Earth. But of course, that's only possible if Mother Earth is allowed to do her thing naturally. And I think maybe that's a little piece of this piece too, is how much of what is going on is unnatural.
Yes, and I was just thinking then when you were talking that I do think there is unnatural stuff going on. I feel it. I live in, as you know, sort of with one foot in the spiritual world and one foot very much planted in the physical. And my way of downloading is through, I guess you'd call it claircognizance. I just get, sometimes you just know. And I know that there's something not right at the moment with, I think people are messing with the weather, and all you have to do is go onto the UK Gov or whatever and look at geoengineering, and there's certainly work going on. And it's a bit like what happens with our pathogens, you know, people are fiddling with pathogens, and that's quite out in the open. They're fiddling with avian influenza, they're fiddling with, you know, all these things all the time in the name of science. The trouble is, you know, having been a scientist myself and going through the whole academia and through the sort of highest level of these institutions, what you get are people doing their job at the top who are really into what they're doing, that they believe 100% in their little or their contribution to the science. But the trouble is it's become reductionist, so every person's doing their little bit in their little lab and none of it hooks up. So unfortunately, some of these things that are being tried out, manipulated for, let's say, for knowledge, they can't see that, you know, the interconnection. This is the problem, is that we aren't, human beings and Mother Earth are not reduced to systems. Everything is linked up. It's living, breathing, beating. Everything is linked. It doesn't work in straight lines. And you start messing with one thing, maybe to get a bit of knowledge. And I do think, honestly, these people who are doing these things, playing with the weather, looking at how geoengineering could help with climate change. They believe in it totally. We're going to save the world. We're going to make a drug that will do this. We're going to, save the world from overheating by putting this in the sky. You have to believe in what you're doing to be the scientist doing that. I think Carrie Mullis said in an interview, which was a brilliant interview, he said what he suddenly realized being at the top level of science is there isn't a group of good guys at the top regulating this. And at that point, he realized, this is the Wild West. This is hugely powerful stuff, and there isn't a group of elders, looking at, okay, how are we going? Should this be released? Should this be happening? No, it's a free for all. Whoever wants to take that information and do what they want with it, for good or for bad, it's the one who shouts the loudest or has the most money. They get to say how those things are used. So I think that's kind of what we're looking at now. Yes, I think the weather's being played with, and maybe some of the things we're seeing. I feel it. Just one little thing before I shut up. With the chemtrails, what I've noticed, and this is not just me, because I treat people every day with my acupuncture, and so I noticed that this is a pattern with other people as well. If there's been a particularly heavy day where you look up the sky and there are crisscross trails everywhere, and I think, is that normal or not? I get really itchy skin. Like really, it's a radiation possibly, but it's notable, and it's animals and people. So yeah, I'll just leave that hanging in the air for people to
well, along with the chemtrails.
Yes.
So some interesting things there, and there are definitely a few points I want to loop back to, so we'll try and find a way to weave all together. But just on this continuing point about the chemtrails, because a lot of naysayers out there who say it's not true and that weather manipulation, all of that isn't true either. So I'm going to throw in a few pieces from my own experience, and one of them was back in 2020, one afternoon, I decided to get all of my plants, my little seedlings, out of my greenhouse, as I used to do sometimes when the weather was good, and put them in the sun, so that they would get some of that glorious Welsh sunshine, which occasionally breaks through the clouds in Wales here and there, before this year, obviously. And I left them out for a few hours, went for a walk, came back, and to my dismay, the entire lot were all wilted and gone yellow. I was actually heartbroken for a little while. So I'm just like, oh my gosh, I've spent months growing all of my food supply, all of my lettuces, all of my rockets, everything had just completely been poisoned and died in the space of 2 hours. And I looked up and I saw the whole sky was crisscrossed, and immediately got that sick feeling. It's just like, oh my gosh, like this is what the weather is. This is what the sky is dropping on us. And like you, I've also had the itchy skin when I was living in Wales, and I always thought it was insects or something. So we've got that side of things going on. I also feel that the chemtrails are possibly putting metals into the atmosphere, which we can talk a little bit about later too, because I feel that's quite an interesting piece, particularly in relation to Dandelion and the heavy metal detoxes that we've been talking a lot about, is that we're actually getting doused from above. I'm pretty certain about that. And when I talk to my teacher, my geomancy teacher, he actually suggested, well, why would you have metal in the atmosphere unless you wanted to project something through on a certain frequency that those metals could resonate with and then be used? So I'm just going to put that one into the mix too. But I also want to loop back to the piece about the insects, because I feel that the plethora of pests that have appeared in the last couple of years may also be connected to less than helpful substances that maybe have been dropped from the sky. So a few bits and pieces there to weave in. And I'd also like just to bring in a couple of news stories that I saw today that are also on a similar tip. The first one is about the infamous monkeypox being renamed by the World Health Organization, because apparently, I think they said it's offensive to monkeys. It's somehow, it's demeaning that particular race of beings. And so they're going to have to rename it with some initials so it doesn't offend any monkeys out there. So I'm wondering whether that's just a rebranding of the situation, because the monkeypox doesn't really seem to have taken hold in the imaginations of the masses. And so it seems to me that one's not working for them. So they're going to have to rebrand it. And secondly, in amongst all of that rebranding is the news coming out of, well, it's coming out of Russia, but it's not the first time they've said it, which is like they're basically outing the fact that the West has been using the Ukraine as a pathogen testing ground on the indigenous people there to create bioweapons, apparently. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on here around testing pathogens, playing God, and generally scaring the crap out of the masses with whatever they found. So do you think these things are all linked, Ems? Do you see a pattern emerging here?
Yes, because we're all on the same planet, so it's all linked. I remember one of my teachers at college when I was studying acupuncture, talking about this whole concept of reductionism versus holism, and in Western medicine, for example, you'd say, oh well, my right finger is I'm getting pins and needles in my right finger, but I've also got diarrhea. You know, do you think they're linked? And in Western medicine, you say, oh no, it's that's nothing to do with that. And you know, in holistic medicine, of course they're linked. It's your body. they're both part of your body, so of course they're linked. They can't not be linked. So in that sense, everything's linked. I think. Where will we go? What was the first thing you were talking about? The insects and
the insects, you know, the possibility of what's being dropped from the sky, whether it's metals, whether it's unhelpful energies, or you know, what do we think is going on here, and why are we seeing these weird things? And also, actually, just on the weather pattern, I was going to say this, that when I lived in the Middle East, it was well known and openly talked about that they used certain geoengineering to create rain in the sky. And so that would happen at the end of the year when we'd have more chance of rain, but they would often go up and they would put stuff into the sky to make it rain. So we know that this is true. This isn't conspiracy theory or rabbit hole. It's openly talked about. It's been talked about for years, and that's not even going into the more rabbit hole ideas of HARP, which I'm sure many of our audience would know about too. So I guess what we're talking about here is the manipulation of Mother Earth in less than positive ways, it seems, because it doesn't seem like this is actually benefiting us right now.
So I think what we've got here is a Tower of Babel situation. Are you familiar with the story of the Tower of Babel?
I am, but please share for those of our audience who might not.
So I'm not a big Bible person, but I do know a few little pieces. And this was actually brought up by Charles Eisenstein in one of his essays, I thought, and I thought it was a brilliant example. It was so in Babylon, they got themselves into such a pickle. You know, everything was just, nothing was working, a bit like it is now, essentially. And I'm sure we've been here many times before. And the solution was, they were trying to become more holy and more, you know, reach the heavenly spirit. You know, how do we get ourselves out of this pit of, you know, this den of iniquity? So we build a tower. If we build a tower, like if we build it tall enough, we will reach heaven. We'll reach the spirits. So this tower just goes on and on and on, and eventually, after it becoming, you know, not sustainable anymore, I think it was realized that you can't tech your way out of a human mess. There's nothing that you can do with purely human technology to rebalance an ecosystem. And when I say an ecosystem, that's involving everything, you know, mental, emotional, spiritual, the whole shebang. The only way you can do that is to come back to a wisdom that's way more holistic, and that includes that of the animals, the plants, the earth, and humans all together. You know, humans have a unique gift to add to that, of being able to conceive of and perceive past, present and future all in one time, because animals don't do that. And I know that from, I'm actually a vet as well, so I've worked for my whole working life with animals, and they have so many spiritual gifts, but they are in the present. They feel and they have empathy, but they don't tell stories like us. We're the only species that tells stories, and that's unique to humanity. And I really think that what we're doing again with all this stuff, geoengineering, pathogen manipulation, we're trying to tech our way out of a big mess, and anyone who shouts the loudest with the best solution is going to be clung on to by a whole heap of people who are very disempowered, because people have forgotten how to connect with the earth, how to look after themselves, how to be their own doctor, how to grow their own food. So if somebody provides an amazing high-tech solution through either, you know, telecommunications or medicines or whatever, then everyone's going to jump on that, because it's much easier for somebody else to sort the problem out than to really come into your sovereignty and sort things out on an individual or a community based thing. So I think where, again, it probably happened with the Atlantis issue, you know, tech just got taken one step too far. And I think we're trying to tech our way out of something which needs intuition, magic, holism and simplicity. And that's the whole, whatever's going on. I think it just gets too confusing to think about, you know, insects, chemtrails, injections, all those sort of things. It's such a mess. And I find my brain just going, you know, it's just too much information. You have to come back to what you can do, simplicity, what every person can do. You have to break it down to what's the bit about that I understand and that I can work with. And I think that's, to me, that is how we're going to intuit our way out of this rather than tech our way out of it.
Yeah, thank you for that view, because I think it's really interesting. And I'm just going to insert something here around the word tech, because I've been playing with this a little bit myself, and even talking about it on some of my recent interviews and podcasts, is that I see two types of tech, or possibly even three types of tech. There is the tech that is made by human hands, that often involves minerals and silicon and stuff that we've dug out of the earth, which I guess is a more AI tech, because increasingly it has that kind of intelligence. Then there is what I would call the plant technology, or the innate technology of Mother Earth, that is fractal and organic. And I see right now that humans are being presented a choice. As we had a full moon in Aquarius this weekend, one of the things, or in the last few days, one of the things that came to me clearly was, how does my new Earth timeline look? My new Earth timeline is basically in connection with the plants of Mother Earth. But for the first time, I very clearly saw the possibility of other new Earth timelines that some people have already signed up to, that involves a different type of tech. So for me, the human technology, I think, is the new Earth that is coming. Once we understand that we are the tech, as me and Pete talked about recently, I think that we can start to think about things differently. And so we can tech our way out of it, but by going inwards and working with our own individual technology, which doesn't require any digging of anything. It just requires us to be very, very present. And, you know, this is where a plant like Dandelion, as we discovered over the last few weeks with the immersion, and we're going to talk a little bit about that now, I think. And again, you know, a large part of what Dandelion shows us is that past, present, and future are all the same thing. So Dandelion brings us very much into the present moment, so that we can be with our own inner tech, rather than looking outside of ourselves for the great savior who's going to come and save all of us. And I'm now seeing very clearly in the bigger picture that there are a lot of the masses who are waiting to be saved. That's not the new Earth way, from what I see. It's like, that's not being sovereign. If you're waiting for somebody to come and save you and pull you out of your mess, you're not on the new Earth timeline. I'm sorry to say. The new Earth timeline is about being sovereign and making choices that you want to make for your life to go the way that you want, rather than waiting for somebody else to make a choice that you then have to react to. So this is one of the things I learned from the immersion, but also, you know, I think that there's a few things that you'd like to from the experience, and also maybe you can just share a little bit with our audience about some of your working with plants and the modalities that you work with. And then I'd like you to talk about what you got with your download about the brainstem, because I think that's super interesting.
Yeah, sure. So tech. So absolutely, where do I start? So I want to share a story to start with around natural tech, and this is fascinating, because I think once you take that first step of stepping into sovereignty over looking after your own body, it's a long journey, and the first step's the hardest to take, to have that confidence. But there comes a point where you realize that you're in free flow communication. You think, my God, and if you took that communication away, my God, you would notice it. It's like, whoa, it's gone. And it creeps in so gently that you wouldn't notice it to start with. So I think, you know, for everyone just to start that dialogue with the natural world, I would challenge anyone not to continue on that journey once that really you've taken that first step. So the plant tech I wanted to talk about was, at the moment I've got a project going on with treating horses with the Artemisias. And it started out with me just treating my donkey at home with mugwort, because she suffers with sweet itch. So for anyone that doesn't know what sweet itch is, it's a hypersensitivity to midge bites, and horses and donkeys can suffer with it. And it's an allergy essentially to the bite. They only need 1 or 2 bites and they'll just itch themselves raw, bleeding. Anyway, this poor donkey, every year her skin was thickened and bleeding by June. And I started about 3 or 4 years ago, just picking the mugwort that was growing in my garden, mashing it up in my hands and just rubbing it all over her, because I know that it's a great anti-parasitic, insect repellent. So I thought, I'll give it a try. And honestly, Keith couldn't quite believe it either. Keith's my husband, also a vet, much less into the plant medicines than I was then, but much more into them now, having seen what Artemisia could do. She was totally recovered within weeks. You know, all her hair had grown back. She was not itching, and it was miraculous. So every year we've treated this donkey now, and then a veterinary parasitology lab became interested and said, look, can we work with you and see if we can make a formulation out of this? And so, which I thought, great, it'll get Artemisia in the picture. And anyway, we did our first year of playing around with the plant this year, and it was really strange. So when we started working with Artemisia, I just felt I felt a little bit like we were sort of stripping her clothes off when she wasn't quite ready, you know, because it was about, you know, how do we mash up the plant? How do we prepare it? It's like, ooh, it's like talking about a person here. It felt quite intrusive. And I just kept that to myself, really. But what I've discovered this year is we made an oil out of it. A, the donkey hated having it put on, and B, it didn't work very well at all. So I gave up after a few treatments and just rubbed her in Artemisia again, just the raw plant, and it worked perfectly. And I was a bit like, oh gosh, that's amazing. So the plant, but what I'm saying in a long-winded fashion is the plant has the tech. So there's something about the whole plant, using the whole plant as itself, as a being. You don't need to strip its clothes off, cut bits off it. You know, it just works as it is. It just does its thing. And I think, you know, we have that tech as humans, and plants have that tech as well, and they're interchangeable. And sometimes, you know, in the pharmaceutical world, you can mimic that really well with certain drugs that do the same things. But really, the most powerful tech is in the whole plant, the whole human. And the sooner we learn how to work with that, the better. The problem is it doesn't make any money. This is what we realized. Like, how do you sell that? It's like, well, I don't really want to sell that, but you could sell it as knowledge. And to me, though, it's more about teaching people to be sovereign over their health. So yeah, all of it comes back to the sovereignty. I think that sovereignty, and you know, the dandelion immersion for me really sort of hammered home that reclaiming sovereignty over everything. It's simple and it's not simple. I think we talked about this in our talk in the immersion. It sounds it's a simple concept, but actually achieving that takes a lot of work, because you have to be prepared to do things for yourself, and make mistakes and have your intuition challenged or be challenged by your peers. So there is work involved. And that's maybe what puts people off doing it. But that was a big thing about the dandelion immersion for me, apart from being in the moment and not being in 10 different places at once, and really owning the moment, and trusting the moment, and not being organized and doing things off the cuff and winging it and loving it and playing with it. You know, all those things were part of it. Those were the things which really came through.
Yeah, and there are plenty of things that you've just said there that I do want to loop back to, but I would also like you just to carry on in the flow a little bit and talk about the brainstem piece, because we're getting into some of the other topics I want to cover today, which is about sovereignty, and also, you know, because you have such a, how to say, multifaceted role in life, with being a vet, being a farmer, being an acupuncturist, a moxabustionist, and a mother of 4, you've got quite a wide perspective on many things. And I feel that there's some very important stuff there that we'd like to talk about today, which is about being sovereign and how do we start to step out of the old paradigm timelines and the system that is basically the matrix that orchestrates all of that. And how do we step out of that onto the new Earth timeline without getting ourselves into a big mess and a big pickle? Because I see that we're at the point now where many people want to exit, but somehow can't, because they've still got one foot in the old timeline and one in the new. And I see that we're at a very, very tricky point. But getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, I'd like you to talk about the brainstem piece, because it also links to the Artemisias. And of course, you've just talked about mugwort, which is a plant you know very well because you are a Moxabustionist. So perhaps we could develop that a little bit.
Okay, so I would start by, from the Chinese medicine perspective, before it became westernized. So people need to understand that really the roots of Chinese medicine amazingly rooted in spirit, and the play between heaven and earth, and what it actually is to be in a human body. And the whole of the writings, 3,000 years of them, of Chinese medicine, is this beautiful discourse of what are we, and what makes us well, and why do we get ill? What, you know, where does illness come from? It's an imbalance, it's a disharmony. So how can we be in harmony in this sort of physical spiritual dance? It's such a spiritual discipline. I couldn't quite believe it when I started studying Chinese medicine, because most of the writings are about the manifestation of spirit in the body and how to work with that, and an acceptance of, you will see physical change as a response to working with spirit in the body and in your person, and vice versa, I have to say, because they very much believe that as below, so above. You know, the human experience plays back into the heavens, and the spirits will interact with us. So, so basically, a key concept in Chinese medicine is that we are fundamentally Jing Shen. So Shen being part of the source, the perfect, undifferentiated source of all things, and we have a little spark of that within ourselves, which sits in a peaceful heart space and enlivens us and fires us through this whole incarnation. And we give that a home through our Jing, which is held in the kidneys. It's the physicality of being human. It's matter inspirited. For the best example I could think of is a fertilized egg. It's a cell, but it contains the vibration of the DNA of the parent. So it is inspirited, but it's undifferentiated. It's matter. So that Jing Shen connection is the fundamental axis of life in Chinese medicine. And then from that, all manner of things about being human spring, and we live this beautiful sort of earthly dance with the elements that may or may not be in harmony. Anyway, I think this is linking to the brainstem thing. So I think what I'm seeing a lot of in my acupuncture work now and in the world at large is a lack of connection between heart and kidney, brain and heart. You know, we talk about living in the heart, and it's so important. But I think for me, the biggest thing is the connection between heart and brain. And brain is interchangeable with kidney in Chinese medicine, because the brain is just the sea of marrow. It's just a switchboard, and it's not a particularly important organ in Chinese medicine. The kidneys are the place that hold the power for the brain. So that interaction between heart and kidney is key. And there are loads of points on the channel that runs up the back of the body, the Dumai, that allow for the connection between the heavens and the heart, you know, to allow kidney and heart to communicate, for a human being to be embodied and whole. And I had a bit of a download the other day, I get all my downloads when I'm out running. Anyway, this download came when I was out running, and it was that what we have to focus on at the moment is the brainstem, because there's something about the brainstem that is being targeted at the moment, not necessarily by individual humans, but by the powers that be, let's call them opposing forces. And there's a targeting of the brainstem to literally sever that connection between head and heart. And one of the ways of doing that is to keep us in our monkey minds, stir it up, you know, overburden it, focus everything on the conscious mind. And it's all about thought, communicate, social media. So we don't really connect with that deep part of our brain that is ancient, and also is the link between heart and head. And that was that's not my medical voice talking. That was a download. And I'm thinking, wow, that's interesting. Because I think, you know, a lot of people who work in the healing arts now are experiencing a hell of a lot of people who really, the lights are on but nobody's home. That there is a sort of severance of connection. So Shen, that the eternal spirit, is not really at home. So that was my download about the brainstem. Do you want me to talk about where Artemisia comes into that, or did you want to?
No, yes, definitely that, because that was the link that I kind of want to loop back with. So yeah, if you could just kind of develop that with the Artemisias and the blood and everything, I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, so Artemisia has for eons, and it actually goes back to the really old Chinese texts, that it was used to treat parasites of the blood. So bark of wormwood was a treatment for malaria and parasites of the blood. And actually a Chinese lady won a Nobel Prize pretty recently, in the last sort of 30 years or so, for discovering artemisinin and its use in treating malaria. And it's to this date the most effective treatment for malaria. And for me, a really important thing there is as well that these drugs, Artemisia, can cross the blood-brain barrier. So that it makes, again, it's making that link between brain and blood, again, which blood in Chinese medicine, it holds the Shen because it passes through the heart. It's like a sort of ambassador of the heart. That's why blood is so sacred. It's inspirited with Shen. So any plant that can work and cross that barrier, cross the blood-brain barrier, ivermectin does as well, which is, you know, why I think it's been such an interesting and talked about drug in these last 2 years, because ivermectin also has that action. It crosses the blood-brain barrier, as do the Artemisias. So I think with certain disease entities we're looking at now, I think the Artemisias, I've grown thousands of wormwood plants and mugwort, because I think they're going to be really important. Yeah.
Thank you for all of that, because yeah, I mean, obviously we both love Artemisias, you know, for different reasons, but both have that, I guess, a little bit of a witchiness about us, because the Artemisias are non-dual beings. They are quite witchy in the way that they work, but they are incredibly powerful plants and powerful beings, and so much to say around that. So yeah, the highly anti-malarial wormwood, just for the record, is the sweet wormwood Artemisia annua, which our good old buddy Mr. Gates has been growing en masse in a GM form. I came to find out a few years ago, because he wanted to corner the market in malarial products. So just to bring that one in. But this whole piece about the disconnection from the heart to, I would say, you know, we could say that within the brain there's also the pineal gland, and we also have our crown chakra. So from an energetic perspective, what I'm seeing is a disconnect between the heart space in the physical body and what I would call the higher self, the fifth dimensional mind. And because that connection isn't there, because I would suggest that the astral planes have been manipulated in various ways over the last 2 years, that it's created a break in the connection between eternal self, higher self, 5D mind, and 3D embodied heart energy. The piece in between, this human emotional realm, which is where we get to process and evolve and develop as beings, has been incredibly manipulated over the last few years. And as a consequence, I'm wondering how many of your patients have somehow been either disconnected or removed from their astral bodies, because that's how I'm reading many of the energy fields of people that I'm treating at the moment.
Yeah, it's tricky to know, because a lot of people weren't in that space anyway.
Right.
I think in my experience, only a really small proportion of people are really consciously working with what you're talking about, you know, as the astral realm. All these, what I said before about, you know, once you've got Jing Shen axis and that fundamental axis, then you have all these other aspects of spirit connected to being a human that are more, you could call them karma, the ancestral spirits, the animal spirits that link you to earth. There's all this sort of plethora of fascinating aspects of spirit that you can dive into in these texts. But I think that's, so few people have been working with that. You know, we talk about it, but how many people really, I find it, when you find somebody that will talk about it, it's like being in a sweet shop, because you can't really talk with many people about these things. And I will get the odd patient that will say, well, you're going to think I'm mad for this. And I just sit back and say, try me. And then we end up, you know, and it's a delight, because they're like, oh my God, I haven't spoken about this to anyone before. Everyone would think I'm off my rocker. I'm like, no, I think you're completely sane. So it's really hard hard, I think, to tell whether there's any distortion on that level, you know, in the astral level, in the what I call the Hun, the spirits are connected to the liver, and how we work with our ancestors in this world, and through us in our sleep plane, and you know, all those interesting juicy bits of being a human embodied. I think those levels are now much more open to manipulation, because that, I think if you've got Jing Shen connected, if you're connected to Shen, then you can't be distorted. You just can't, because it's simple and it's pure and you know it. And I think that in answer to your question, probably yes, there are a lot more people who are in a really confused place astrally, because that Jing Shen has been broken. And yes, actually thinking about it now, that put it this way, that I've got a lot of very scattered patients, some physically, some emotionally, some mentally, but then, you know, to my patients' credit, you know, I would say 30% of my patients haven't gone down the route that most people in the UK have gone down in response to this last couple of years. So I've got probably a disproportionate representation in my patients of people who have really not accepted anything into their bodies and are still in a clear space. It's a bit of a wishy-washy answer, I'm afraid, but that's the best I can do.
We're talking around the houses here because we're both healers and we're coming at it from different perspectives, in the same way that me and Pete do when we do the podcast, because he's a herbalist. And I think it's interesting to bring in these different real world perspectives from those of us who are treating people. And, you know, I feel like it's important that we get to share what we see, because we are, some of us, working multidimensionally, and we're not just looking at the end result in the 3D. We're actually asking the question, is what is going on here beyond the physical plane? Which is, I think, really important as part of the shift to a much more 5D New Earth understanding, which is that we are not just the physical components that are here in this realm. We are many, many different things. And, you know, I love these very, very old traditions like the Eastern medicine and many other different cultures, you know, whether it's Ayurveda from India or the more shamanic practices of different indigenous cultures. It's like when we really go into these much older pieces of wisdom about holistic healthcare, we suddenly realize that they make a lot more sense than what we've been given over the last 500 years, which is a much more reductionist way of looking at things. And, you know, you said something really interesting about using the whole plant and how it worked much more effectively when you were rubbing it on with your hands, and how the plant was just going on in its natural form. The moment that you started to muck around with it, synthesize it, turn it into something potentially for commercial gain, it didn't want to work that well. Which, knowing Mugwort very well, she's a tough lady, a great teacher. I love Mugwort to bits, as I know you do, and you work with her obviously in the Moxa. But this is not, you don't treat a being, a witch queen of the herbs like Mugwort, by stripping her of her clothes and, you know, doing all those things to her. That's actually really offensive, I think, anyway. But it raised an interesting point. I remember some friends of mine who were Bwiti initiates working with the sacred African root Iboga. From the country of Gabon, and some of our audience out there may even heard of Ibogaine, which is the Western reduced version of Iboga, which apparently has isolated the incredibly powerful alkaloids that are supposedly good for treating addiction. So, you know, this plant actually is considered a national treasure in Gabon, and it's illegal for the plant to actually leave Gabon, but that doesn't stop it being poached along with elephants into the Ivory Coast. So it's quite a big situation. But the point I want to make is that when these indigenous people, the Bwiti people, started to realize that the plant was being smuggled out to make ibogaine, they were like, A, horrified that was going on, but B, were just like, why are you taking aspects of the plant out? The plant works as a whole. There's no need to remove anything. It works as a whole. And I think that this is a really, really simple but really important point, is that why do humans feel the need to take something that is perfectly, brilliantly, beautifully formed, already perfect, and decide to take bits out and then use it? To me, it just seems actually backwards. And so I often wonder about this, because we've been sold this kind of methodology that we can take a medicine out of the wild, take into laboratory, patent it, reduce it into something lesser than what it was, and then sell it commercially for a whole lot of money. And so I see that we, in this one situation here, we're very much looking at the crux of how we view medicine for ourselves in the modern world.
Absolutely. And this, more than the ridiculousness of trying to take a piece out of something which works really well anyway, which is illogical, for me, this started, it was so interesting right from the beginning of the conversations we were having we were in discussions with a few different labs, actually. As soon as they started asking questions about mugwort, and I'll tell you what the first question was, well, what are we going to do about somebody who might be pregnant using it and applying it? And I was like, oh my God, she wouldn't, this is mugwort. This is like, you know, and I felt quite sort of protective of her as a being, because I was like, you have to understand. Honestly, I said, I've worked with this plant for so long, it's fine. But then I had to get back into my legal head, I suppose, and say, well, I guess, you know, if you're looking at making a medicine that's going to be marketed, then you have to go down those routes. You have to go down, tick all the boxes, because otherwise, A, you won't be able to use it, or B, you know, everyone's terrified of liability. Man.
They are the bane of the world, the goddamn tick boxes.
Absolutely. But it was more, for me, it was more of a sense of, I was almost betraying this plant by allowing these conversations about picking her apart and all these, and I felt it really strongly. And I think it was that respect, that understanding that we're in interaction with another conscious being, and you don't talk about doing something to that person, you don't talk about doing something to that plant, you talk about doing something with it, and engaging it in a process rather than using it for a process. And I think this is a really crux thing, is that you don't use nature, you work with nature.
I agree.
Don't get me wrong, I think about this a lot because I've been brought up in medicine. I've got, you know, grandfather, father, they were all doctors, so I've been brought up in the medical world from before I was even a glint in the eye, and so I'm very familiar with the world of medicine. And I also know that there are some cases where reductionist medicine is the treatment of choice. Emergency surgery, you know, if you have an accident, you need a trauma surgeon, you need somebody who can work with the life-saving techniques and medications that will stop you bleeding out. For that moment in time, it's a very focused moment. It's focused, it's reductionist, it's about survival. And then you look to healing, you know, you look to balance. And I think that's where our whole system needs to sort of redress itself, is that reductionist medicine has become what is used 100% of the time, whereas actually it should be used probably 1% of the time. And that's all about cash. I mean, it's all about money. It's all about marketing. I grew up with a father who, my entire household was full of drug company labeled merchandise, because, you know, that they would approach doctors with, your whole house would be kitted out with these different drugs. I used to have Canestin all over my pencil case, which was hugely embarrassing at school, my Canestin rulers and all this sort of stuff, because that's what Dad had been given by the drug rep. And, you know, it's so pushed. I mean, it is, you know, this, everybody knows this now, this is old news. It's the medicine has become a marketing tool for pharmaceuticals, and it only takes one generation to lose a skill, and we've almost lost that skill of knowing how to work with natural remedies now, which should be used 99% of the time. And I don't think we'll lose it, because from what I see, and this is from patients, from the general public, there's huge thirst for understanding plants and how to work with them. For whatever reason, either people realize that the world's falling apart and they'll have to make their own medicines, or people just love it and know that it's right. So I don't think we are going to lose it. And I think when you start working with plants, you realize that actually deep in our psyche, because they've been so much a part of our evolution, all that knowledge is there. I've been amazed by how the knowledge comes back. You just need a cue. For me, it's just a cue. If I want to start working with a plant, I find some information, I cross-reference it, I'm like, no, I know that. That's okay, it's in. Remember that. Don't have to look it up again. It's there. It's so deeply rooted. And I think I don't think that's unique to me. I think it's in our human collective. And more and more people are tapping into that now. And it's a beautiful way of working. It works. We don't need to rip things apart.
I agree 100% with all of that. And, I think what I'm seeing within my world and through doing a lot of these interviews and working with the plants over a number of years is that there is a very strong concerted remembrance of what we already know. And from my own perspective, it was the very first time I drank ayahuasca that suddenly that remembrance came back whilst having a conversation with a plant in an altered state of consciousness. I was reminded that I knew how to do that with other plants, which I didn't believe at that moment, but subsequently a decade later, here I am doing what I do. And I think part of the reason that it's come intuitively to me and to people like you and others is that actually we're just remembering about this wisdom because it's already stored within us. And again, this comes back to our own inner tech. And so it's like, and again, the astrology supports this right now. The Uranus in Taurus, is our friend and wonderful astrologer Pam Gregory often talks about, is grassroots up. And so what I see again with this full moon in Aquarius this week is like, this is one route to a new way of being, which is being more holistic, being in co-creation, working with, and I think that's really important rather than using. And I'm always on this tip, and I know that you are too. Language is something that we both recognize as being very important because words are spells. And so maybe that's a conversation we're going to get into a little bit more in a future podcast because we're running out of time today. But this idea of working holistically, I think, is super important. It's just like, would you dream of going to a hospital and taking your doctor apart piece by piece to see how does he work and then putting him back in the way that you think is best and then seeing if he still does the same job as well as he did before you took him apart? Of course you wouldn't. So why would you do it to a wonderfully profound, being like Lady Mugwort, Artemisia vulgaris, who is way more sophisticated than probably all of us here on the planet? And I find this increasingly, and Dandelion, oh my gosh, to be in conversation with Dandelion, not just over this last 2.5 weeks with the immersion, but over the last few years, particularly the last 6 months, is to be in communication with a being that is a star being, that is utterly profound, bordering possibly on Buddha nature. And I'm just like, once we start to understand that these beings are manifesting through a 3D form that appears like a plant, but actually there is this whole other being behind it, we can also see that we're not so different. Somehow we've manifested into these meat bags in this life that have been named Emily and Davyd, but actually I'm just the emanation of a much more powerful being that has emanated in many different forms across many different timelines, possibly in different parts of the universe. And so I think if we can start to see ourselves and the plants in this way, we can start to get an idea of the multidimensionality of many different things, which is a much more exciting way of living, I think, than reducing everything down to a few alkaloids in a pill.
Yeah, I mean, you can start getting really, I have to stop myself because as I said before, I think I live with one foot firmly rooted in the physical world, having 4 children and just
running a farm,
yeah,
and a healing clinic and everything else that you get to do.
Very
rooted
in the soil and physicality. But so I have to stop myself getting too way out. But actually this brainstem download took me just a little tiny bit further, which because we are on the Web of Wyrd, I think we'll probably share. But yes. I had the vision sort of expanded as far as the brainstem was linked with Saturn. And it was almost like I went into the place of my brainstem and I could feel, the reason I say Saturn, and I think I'm right in this, was that I experienced this sense of these rings just spiraling out around me and just permeating everything on one plane, but it was I was in the brainstem, but the rings of Saturn were sort of spinning out around me for as far as I could perceive them. And I did wonder at that point, I thought, gosh, then my conscious brain kicked in, which sort of stopped the vision because I went into my conscious mind. And I did wonder about how much do we store in the brainstem, because I know that, we have existed probably or had connections with many of the other planets in our solar system, and the Saturnian existence. How does that link with the brainstem? I don't know. I'm just now putting this out there because it is way off, but it was part of the vision, and it did just. And Saturn's also one of the rulers of Aquarius, isn't it? The other ruler. So you've got Saturn and Uranus. So it's the sort of more structured, down to earth, practical ruler of Aquarius. So yeah, that's just a little piece of mind candy, as Dolores Cannon, lovely Dolores Cannon, if anybody knows about her, talks about it. She says, take it as mind candy, just chew on it for a bit and see how it sits. So yeah, that I think
thank you for that. It's a very web of Wyrd insight, and I love it. And you know, it's just making me think about a couple of things just to bring in. So when I worked with my teacher Michael Dunning, the yew shaman, with the yew mysteries, which we did in Wales for 5 years, working with many of the old yew trees, he often linked the yew tree, the tree of eternity, to Saturn.
okay.
You know, so they could, you know, and he would often talk about the Saturnian world, which was before the sun came in. So before we got the solar beings, we had the very yin other world, which, you know, as we learned through the mysteries of the yew mysteries, that the earth was actually bathed in a Saturnian kind of dusk light. So hence the sort of perpetual dusky feel that the other world often has, because it's I feel like a previous version of Earth. But you know, what's also interesting is that this full moon was actually a fixed grand cross with 6 different planets, all in fixed signs, and actually Saturn, which is still in Aquarius, was conjunct the moon. You know, so, and of course Uranus has been conjunct Mars in Taurus, and we've got the South Node in Scorpio there, like bringing everything from the past into the mix. And what I feel like we're being asked to look at right now is, what is my Saturn structure for myself in the Aquarian age? How does it look and feel for me? And interestingly for me, I actually have Saturn in Leo, bang opposite Saturn in Aquarius right now. So it's, you know, and the whole Dandelion immersion for me has been bringing forth many different concepts and ideas about how do I navigate myself into the new earth? Like, how am I doing it? Well, what Dandelion showed me is I'm doing it in the present moment from my heart energy, which connects me to my unconditional love 5D mind. So I'm choosing to navigate my way into the new earth timeline, the Aquarian age, with this kinds of you know, ideas and motifs. And you know, I just want to for the last few minutes just talk about something that I think we're probably going to talk about quite a bit over the next few months, which is the structure, and exiting the structure that we have been living under for the last several thousand years, or all of our lives up until now. And how difficult is it actually to step out of the old Saturnian structure into the new one that you are creating for yourself, that doesn't depend on somebody else giving it to you? So as somebody I know who has a foot very much in both worlds, not necessarily because you want to, but because that's what life has given you at this moment, I'm just wondering if you have anything to share with other people out there who might be experiencing the same kind of conundrums right now.
I've got loads to share about that. Really, there's 2 aspects to it. I think the first is, it takes a huge amount of energy to overcome the inertia of being in such a bureaucratic, sticky, treacle system. So my family and I have, over the last 14 years, built our own place from scratch, from the soil. We're not hooked up to anything. We make our own electricity. We've got our own water. Everything is off grid. So we're not dependent. The only thing we depend on is the internet. Other than that, we do it all. And that's a joy. And it's incredibly liberating. But oh my God, it's nearly taken every ounce of my physical being to make it happen. And the same for my other half. You know, my kids don't know anything else, but we are at the point in our lives now. So yeah, I'm mid-40s, he's mid-50s, and we're both at a point where we're not spent, but we need a break, because the energy required to overcome, it's a bit like changing states. If anyone's a scientist, you know, change a state from solid to liquid, then liquid to gas. You need to put in that extra boost of energy to achieve gasification, you know, evaporation, whatever change of state you're trying to achieve. But that final change of state requires the most energy, and this, whatever it is, the solid or the liquid, is constantly wanting to stay as it is, so it's always pulling you back in. So it's really hard work to exit a system that's so entrenched, but I would say it's a really good start. And actually, for me, the key start is making the physical changes that make you more independent, because that starts the ball rolling. Because what that does is we call them John Seymour moments. I don't know if anyone's read John Seymour's books on self-sufficiency, but you have these moments where you think, oh, I'm self-sufficient. That energy, I just did my clothes washing from spring water that's powered by hydroelectric. Woohoo! And it's just uplifting. You just think, I don't need anyone else. That was purely from the soil and from the water, and from it's beautiful. And those are the moments which keep you going. But to achieve that sovereignty, you have to go on, I'd call it one more step in the zodiac. You have to do the Virgo, you have to put the bloody work in. As I put the work in, put one foot in front of another, get the work done, and you just have to keep going. And I think there's that element. That sounds a bit hard going, but I'm not going to beat around the bush. It is hard going, but the rewards are huge. So I'd say to anyone who wants to exit the system now, start putting the work in any tiny way. Even if you just become self-sufficient in one thing, it's brilliant. You'll get the bug. And the other thing is that we're doing it on our own, and that's not sustainable. I think what's going to have to happen for everybody to achieve this state, or the people that want to, is that we work as teams and communities. You can't do it on your own, it's too much. So people are going to have to skill share. So that's another thought to put in the pot. The other thing about stepping into the sort of Saturnian realms, and this was coming through as you were talking about Saturn being the sort of dim twilight and the yew tree being in charges. I had a message from yew tree. I've got a yew tree that I communicate with regularly, and it's given me a few messages, but one of them was that we're becoming more porous. And there's a lot of things happening because of that. A, we're becoming more sensitive to things around us. But B, you know, we're like those rings of Saturn. Who knows how far the influence of that goes out? We're porous with our environment, and that was a really clear message from you. And it's kind of going into that sort of misty realm of we are part of this soup. I'm not quite sure how that ties in with making the step, but I think just being aware of that is really key. So you can give yourself a break if things get hard. You think, no, you do feel things, and we are feeling things from other people, and we do affect other people, which is a good thing, but it's also makes things a little bit harder sometimes, because you have to develop boundaries and know thyself and all that inner work that we talk about loads. So there's that inner work to do as well as the outer work in order to live in that more connected way. And the final thing to say about living with a foot in both worlds, it's going to be really messy. It's not going to happen. It's not going to be the golden age and it's just going to suddenly happen. And there are beautiful moments, believe me, but I really think is to try and focus on what you do really well. Find your inner lion heart, your dandelion, and know your skill and know what you can do, and don't look around too much. Just focus on that and become sovereign in that one bit of life that you can do. Because if you look at the whole thing, it's just going to be utterly overwhelming. That's what I would say about living with a foot in both worlds. It's messy. Messy and hard work, but massively necessary and massively rewarding.
Wow, thank you, Ems. And I know this is going to be a piece that we're going to return to in future podcasts, because it's going to unfold, I think, for everybody over the next, I think until the end of the year. The astrology to me seems to suggest that the very messy pieces that we're going to have to deal with as the old timeline collapses. I often get the very sort of strong image of like the Titanic sinking. 2/3 of the boat is already under the water. There's still a third left that's above the water. There's lots of people on the end of it going, help. I feel like I want to jump off now, but oh my God, all of the lifeboats have gone, and we're all in the lifeboats going, yeah, we're over here, thanks. Because we decided to jump off a little while ago. And they're like, can you come back and get us? And we're like, well, we could, but we might get pulled down when the rest of the boat goes down. So I kind of think it's not necessarily the most cheerful of images, but I think it's a good one to kind of have in your mind. It's like, where am I? Am I in the lifeboat already away from the sinking ship, or am I still on the sinking ship, either already under the water and overwhelmed and consumed, or am I still somewhere above the waterline looking around for help? And I think that this is quite a good analogy for where we're all at right now, is, and I think what you said is really good also about how do we start making those steps? And I think, for me, the one piece that I'm always going on about is become sovereign with your health. become sovereign with your medicines, start to empower yourself by working with Dandelion to bring you into the present moment. The next immersion that we've got coming up over the autumn equinox is the Artemisias, 13-day immersion with the Artemisias, to help bring all of those wonderful cleansing qualities, particularly for the parasitic energies. But also one of the other major qualities, as you all well know from working with it in Moxa, is the energy of realignment that the Artemisias can give us. And when we get realigned, we can actually iron out those kinks that are maybe between our 3 and 5D self in the human emotional realms by actually letting the Artemisias bring up from the shadows, which is what they're very good at doing, the stuff that we've not dealt with, whether that's individual or collective. Right now, that's the place we're at, and there's so much resistance I feel within the collective energy to looking at the shadow, even though it's been very, very clearly presented on the TV. If you're not believing how it's being presented, but you're cross-referencing and understanding that what we're watching is really a theatre performance playing out, then you can start to understand how we've been manipulated through that performance. So these are different little steps I think we can start to take about being sovereign, is like opening our eyes to ourselves, and then in doing that we can also open our eyes to what's going on around us. And I totally concur with what you said about, this is a time for team efforts. And I think that's also part of the astrology right now, is about tribes, finding the people that we resonate with. And, what I can say from my own experience is that I've started approaching people over the last couple of years from a much more 5D perspective down. So the connection comes at the heart level, which then, is really coming from 5D. And when the resonance between any of us at the heart level is there, that then we can understand that we have a connection that can transcend some of the more difficult 3D moments. But if we come in at the 3D without any of that energy connection, and we're getting all bent out of shape with the emotional triggers that people are offering to us, all of us, then everything can get a little messy. So I also see there's a very exciting opportunity here to recalibrate how do we meet other people, equals and opposites. That's also a little piece about being sovereign. So I like what you said, let's take those steps. If it's too much to do it all at once, find the ways of dealing with it. Am I sovereign with my health? Am I sovereign with my finances? Am I sovereign with my education or my children's education? How are we handling all of these things? Because the political, medical, and educational systems are going to collapse. I think that's inevitable. And I think it's actually probably what is needed in many ways, because as we can see from the ridiculous performances of our so-called leaders to be, is that the political system's morally corrupt anyway, and has been for a long time, and is actually imploding as we're watching it unfold on the television. We can also tell from all the things we've talked about that we've got a similar situation in our healthcare system, and underneath all of that, of course, is how our children are being educated into those political, financial, healthcare systems in the first place. So I think that we're looking now at a great opportunity to radically rethink how do we organize ourselves as beings, as individuals, within a society, within our tribes, and how do we start building from the grassroots up by working with the natural energies and developing whole different systems for education, healthcare, and even organization of ourselves.
It's really exciting, and it's also not unprecedented. I've found it quite bemusing over the last couple of years about how many times the word unprecedented has been used, because if anybody, I'm not a historian, I'm just interested in history. And these things happen all the time. Civilizations rise and fall, governments come and go. They don't stay the same. And things collapse. And my kids have started watching this great YouTube channel called Oversimplified, and it's teaching them the politics of like the Second World War and Napoleon, and I find myself sort of being dragged in and listening. It's brilliant, and it's accessible to the kids, and they love it. And you just think, you listen to these things, and that's only our very recent history, and you think, my God, there's been revolutions and collapses and riots, and I mean, total chaos in our history. And from that is always birthed a new paradigm. Actually, that's another thing about the Chinese, is that their written history goes back so much further that you only have to look at Chinese history to look at the rise and fall of dynasties, and also their wise people, their sages, have written so much about governments. I mean, it's quite interesting. A lot of even the medicine is about how the body works like a government. They're quite fascinated by politics and how that plays out in our human world and our bodies, and I think it was Lao Tzu has written this one comment in one of his writings, and it says, how should you govern a very large country? And the answer is that you should govern it as you would cook a very small fish, very lightly. And I love that. And the Chinese writing is full of all this wisdom about, you know, how governments just end up basically shooting themselves in the foot by becoming too big and corrupt and self-serving. And you just think we've done this time and time and time again. And I think maybe the difference this time is that we should do it more consciously. We've got all this information at our fingertips. You know, let's really see what is going on and be aware of how this has played out over history, and just shining the light on that, on the shadow. When you said that about shadows, I did just think really briefly about something I noticed the other day, that even a butterfly makes a shadow, and they're such ethereal creatures, but they still make a shadow. And whenever anything comes into being in the physical world, we create shadow. That's part of what it is. You know, when Shen, you know, enters the vibrational world of matter, by necessity, we butt up against other things, and that's, you know, reflects back to you what you are, and that's how Chinese medicine works. That's how diagnosis in Chinese medicine works, is where is the disharmony and vibration with somebody in their environment or their family or their food, and it's recognized that, you know, Shen embodied, everything embodied makes a shadow.
Right.
You know,
and of course the light casts the shadow.
yes,
you know,
that's
so
what I mean. Exactly.
we should never
what I
forget
mean.
that. That's duality. You know, the shadow is okay. The shadow is the juicy, decomposing stuff that the growth comes out of, right? And that's why the Artemisias, I love them, because they bring all of that stuff into the light so that we can work with it. And, you know, that's why I love my work. You know, it's also probably why I love being a Scorpio, is I like doing that work that brings the shadow up into the illuminated space so that it can be transformed and released. And, you know, this is why I love the Artemisias. But I love what you said about the Lao Tzu quote there. And you're right, there are so many of these great analogies and kind of explanations of very complex things in just a handful of words.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be something that we focus on a lot in future podcasts, is about words and spells and languages. But we have come to the end of this first podcast working together, Emily, which I think has been super interesting. We've covered a lot of ground, as we do often in our own personal conversations, but hopefully our audience has got a few of the little motifs and flavors that we've dropped in, things to think about. A lot of Web of Wyrd is about creating sort of potential light bulb moments to connect dots, because it is the Web of Wyrd, it's the web of life, everything is interconnected. It is the mycelial network of nature, without any overlays. And it's like, you know, when we remember how we're all interconnected, we can share these little pieces across the web, that, you know, the part of the web that we're on, and maybe we can connect with other people in that way. So I've certainly enjoyed this today. Is there anywhere that people can find you, Em, if they want to come and have a treatment with you in Wales? Or I know that you're not really a tech person, I don't think you have a website, but is there anywhere that people can contact you in any way?
No, not really.
I know that you're trying to hide out in the valleys of Wales and not be found, but unfortunately, you're on YouTube, love. So
sorry, David. I love connecting with people, and I always love building new relationships with the people that I work with the acupuncture. I have actually found that during the last couple of years, my patient base has become bigger, and it's at least doubled, but it's really condensed into our local community, and a little bit wider as well still, but it's become so visceral and word of mouth and connected to the community, and the farming community particularly, that I just haven't got any space to do any more treatments as such. I am in the process, I'll tell you, which will eventually be put out there, of developing a, in contrast to Big Pharma, I'm developing Forest Farmer in Forest Coalpit, where we farm. And we're starting out as a study group to learn and work with plants and draw them and take them and read about them and talk about them. And between me and a couple of others who are into the teaching scene, we're going to try and develop an educational sort of pharmacopoeia on farm, linked to my husband runs a charity called Stump Up for Trees, which is reforesting unusable bits of land on steep bracken banks on farms and that sort of thing. So so there's a little line out there.
So basically what you're saying is that you've been hiding out in the valleys of Wales for a long time, but now you're realizing that you can't do it for an awful lot longer. And so we're putting you out there through the Web of Wyrd into the public awareness, so that you can now be pested relentlessly by lots of people who want to connect with you. So I feel like those days of being the quiet country witch, going about doing your little bits and pieces with your clients is about to end, Emily, you know. So we will find a different way, and I can tell that your real world life is very much interjecting now with the beeping of your phone in the background. So look, we're going to end it there for today. Thank you so much, Emily Watt, for coming on and being a new co-host on the Web of Wyrd. I will be back with Pete next week in our regular fortnight slot, and we're going to be doing this once a month, I hope, Emily, bringing in the magic and wisdom of Eastern medicine and plant medicine from the valleys of Wales into the wider collective. So I'm super excited, and you know, thank you, Emily, for a great chat today. You got a final word to share with our audience?
Oh, it's been really fun. I don't like putting myself out there, as you can probably tell, but I think there comes a point where I think everybody should, if you've got something to say, it doesn't matter what it is. This is part of the Dandelion thing, I think. It's just, you know, put your stuff out there, shine your light, you know, be a Leo, you know, be in that energy. And I'm really happy to do that and see where it takes me. And if any of this, like you said, is a light bulb moment for anyone, that's what we do with each other. That's what humans do. That's what it's about. Just sharing knowledge, connecting. We're becoming more porous. Bring it on.
Aho. And you know, when we do that from the heart space, we create a very powerful force in the world that I think can overcome anything else. Actually, the power of the heart and the power of unconditional love, as my teacher Patrick Romano would often say, is pound for pound the most powerful force in the whole universe. So I think that's a beautiful place to end. Thank you, everybody, for listening today to a Web of Wyrd special with myself and Emily, and we'll catch you again for a future show. Ciao for now.